This is Josh Barrow, and welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your civilized yet provocative antidote to the self-contained opinion bubbles that dominate political debate. It's the fourth week of April, and this was the week we got to 20. That is 20 declared candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination. And the latest addition is an important one. Former Vice President Joe Biden announced his campaign in a video message with a frontal attack on President Donald Trump. Biden leads the national primary polls, but he also has a lot of detractors in the primary. There are those who say he's not far enough left. Elizabeth Warren has already criticized him for siding with banks over borrowers in the 2005 bankruptcy reform, which had strong support from credit card issuers based in Biden's home state of Delaware. There are also concerns about his positioning on race and gender throughout his decades in public office, starting with the issue of school busing in the 1970s, continuing through the Clarence Thomas hearings, which he oversaw as chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and there is the question of whether he's been too touchy-feely. All that said, there's no better test than Biden for the question of how representative media and activist discussion is of broad opinion in the Democratic Party. In addition to leading the polls, Biden also outperforms other Democrats in general election ballot tests against President Trump. He polls best with older voters, who may not be represented in the Twitter criticism. And Biden will surely run on a restoration of the Obama-Biden legacy, one that remains enormously popular with Democratic voters at large, even as some leftist activists criticize Obama as a failed president. As his campaign plays out and Biden faces more attacks in high-profile press with the public paying attention, we will see whether the progressive commentariat is a leading indicator on him or just out of touch. Now, let's bring in the Left, Right, and Center panel. As always, I'm your center, and I'm joined by Rich Lowry, editor of National Review on the right. On the left is Jonathan Capehart of The Washington Post. Hello.
Hey, Josh.
Hey, Josh.
Also joining us today is Olivia Nuzzi, my colleague and Washington correspondent for New York Magazine. Hello, Olivia.
Hi.
So, Jonathan, what did you make of the Biden announcement?
Josh, I actually thought Vice President Biden's announcement was a good one and a provocative one in that a lot of conversation has been about, like, do you attack Trump? If you attack Trump, you're playing into his hands. We should be focused on that. But I thought the way the vice president went at him was actually the smart way. He did it not personally, but as a matter of a call to action to the nation for being better than the man who is president now. And I think that attacking Trump directly on his response to Charlottesville was exactly the right way to go. How can you argue with someone who is saying praising Nazis and white supremacists is a bad thing?
Olivia, Biden has been kind of a presence on the campaign trail without actually being there. He's been looming over this campaign as someone who's leading in the polls. What do you hear about him on the ground from voters? Do people seem eager for him to get into this race? Do they share some of the concerns that you hear from national activists?
Well, it's interesting. Certainly on the operative level, people I've talked to for the last, year at this point have just been waiting to hear what Biden will do. And there's been this kind of guessing game. And some weeks it seemed like he definitely would get in. Other weeks it seemed like he wouldn't. But a lot of people I know in politics were waiting until he made his decision to make their own decisions about what they would do for 2020. And when it comes to voters, they really just want to hear from everybody right now. A lot of them are still learning about someone like Mayor Pete and the other candidates who are running. And it seems like they are not really resigned to the idea that he's this inevitable front runner, and they don't really seem to be taking it very seriously that Biden and Bernie Sanders are leading most of the polls, which they are. That seems to not be a concern at this point for them, or they're not really weighing it very heavily, which I think is interesting, because the polls for 2016, at least on the Republican side, they never really changed too much. I mean, Donald Trump was leading from the beginning. It never really changed. The only thing that changed was pundits saying whether or not we should take that seriously.
Rich, I think we've gotten a preview of how the president will deal with Joe Biden in this race. We saw Matt Schlapp, who's a conservative activist who's a strong ally of the president, basically criticizing Biden as a sex pest, saying that he wouldn't want Biden living near his daughters, which on one level feels like a remarkable angle to be taken from the Donald Trump camp. But on the other hand, I think we saw in the 2016 campaign his gleeful approach to Bill Clinton about these issues. I guess the question is, obviously Joe Biden is not Bill Clinton. Is that going to be an effective and useful line of attack for the president and his allies?
I don't think the Biden touching rises to that level. It didn't create an impeachment scandal, or it hasn't impressed itself on the national consciousness in the same way that Bill Clinton's lapses did. I was struck by the harshly anti-Trump message in the announcement, was a way to avoid going left on substance. And interestingly, the other candidates out on the field, even out in the field, others that were further to the left than Biden are not emphasizing Trump so much. They'll hit him sort of incidentally, but they say this isn't really the message that Democratic voters are interested in, or not what they get a lot of questions about. And also, Biden's message, America's an idea. It's a place that affords everyone the opportunity to rise. Very kind of lowest common denominator American rhetoric that is also very interesting now and sort of has a political charge in this field that might not otherwise, because it's very different from the message we're hearing from some of the more progressive candidates that America is not such a great place and has these deeply embedded systemic class and racial biases. That wasn't Biden's message at all. I think his basic bet that there are a lot of Democrats out there who are desperate to beat Trump and are much more pragmatic than what we hear and see on Twitter and on cable is right. It just doesn't necessarily mean they're going to go with Biden ultimately, because there are going to be some other candidates playing to that constituency as well.
Well, Rich, I would argue that, it's not one message or the other, it's both. I argue with your contention that other candidates are saying America's not a great place and there are all these problems that are wrong. Yeah, there are all these problems, but I would argue that all of the candidates are running to make America live up to its ideals for everyone in this country, and whether it's through healthcare policy, tax policy, raising the minimum wage, voting rights, or if it's about restoring the idea of America as it has been for a couple of centuries now as a beacon to the rest of the world, I think they're all basically on the same message. It's just a matter of emphasis. And I think as a first shot message, I think Vice President Biden got everyone's attention. The next part for him is going to be to catch up to those other candidates who've been in the field now for a couple of months, articulating policy ideas and positions. And I think when it comes to that, we're going to be talking about shades of gray between all 20. There aren't, like huge radicals, with the exception of Bernie, who's not actually a Democrat, but anyway. We're talking about shades of gray in the end when it comes to policy.
I want to ask Olivia about one of those candidates who has been in the field for a while, Kamala Harris. I know you spent some time with her this week in New Hampshire. She was the number 2 fundraiser in the first quarter within the field. She's generally third or fourth in the national polling. What do you see her doing on the ground? What kind of message is she out there with?
She takes a less holistic approach than some of the other candidates, like Pete Buttigieg. Voters, it's hard to get a read when you're relying on voters in New Hampshire, because New Hampshire is such an unusual place, and people there are kind of like professional candidate observers. So when you talk to people who watch Kamala Harris speak in New Hampshire, you're not really getting like the opinion of ordinary voters. So I'm hesitant to rely on that, and that was the state that I was seeing her in. But it's interesting the amount of media attention that she receives. We went to one stop in a bakery. It was this tiny little place, and the press outnumbered the voters there, the patrons in the bakery, probably like 3 or 4 to 1. And to the extent that it was annoying people in the bakery who were there to see Kamala, who were not members of the press. And every event seems to be heavily attended by the media. And it's interesting that it's not really translating to her having the same type of moment, using scare quotes here, as somebody like Mayor Pete or somebody like Beto had early on. But it's so early yet. I think the debates will really be what changes things. And it's hard to talk about how things are shaping up right now and what the polls say, because it's just so early. It's like 19 months until the next election.
Jonathan, you were telling a story about your mom's reaction to Kamala Harris that I thought was interesting.
Oh, you're putting me on the spot, Josh. My mom's going to hear this and I'm going to be in big trouble. Look, my mom said to me when we were talking, and I was asking her about the field. This was back in maybe January. And she just sort of flat out said, I think the next president has to be a white male. And I said, well, wait a minute, but there's Senator Kamala Harris. What about her? And she said, nope, we need a white male to straighten all this mess out. Then the country can have a black woman president or, a person of color. And so then I asked her, well, then who's the white male? And she said, Joe Biden. Fast forward a couple of months, my husband, who's from North Dakota, red state, but from a Democratic family, talking to his mom about the race. And she, too, had the same thing, that she thought it would be a white male, but for different reasons, because the country, she didn't think, was ready to vote for a woman. And he asked her, who are you thinking of? And she said, Joe Biden. So here you have two women, Midwest, one born and raised in the South, one late 70s, the other one early 60s, one white, one black, and they're both coming to the same conclusion, which I think when you look at the polls, yes, right now Joe Biden is leading in the polls. A lot of that is name recognition, but I do think that some of it has to do with some ongoing affection towards him and knowledge of him as vice president to President Obama.
It's interesting, Rich, the hesitation that Jonathan describes there, because when I look at what President Trump says about the Democratic field, it's clear to me that he's scared of Kamala Harris and that he sort of has an admiration for her political skills. I think, she's good at a lot of the sort of set piece things that Donald Trump is good at. She draws big crowds and has an aura in them. He really seems to think, at least implicitly, that she's one of the strong candidates in this field. There are some other people in the field he'd much rather face.
Yeah, and also clearly he considers Biden a threat. And Biden on paper is very strong, in part for some of the reasons Jonathan outlined. There's a fondness around him. But, I mean, just one thing we should all have real modesty about is, as pundits, as a class, is that we know anything about electability. It was partly blown up in 2008 when people would have thought, oh, well, Hillary is more electable than Obama, and certainly blown up in 2016 when a lot of Democrats were rooting for Trump, and a lot of us on our side of the aisle were opposing him because we thought he'd be such a disastrous general election candidate, and of course he wins.
Rich, I know you had something you wanted to discuss regarding Elizabeth Warren, who is one of the candidates who I think has gotten a little less traction than some people expected in this campaign. But she made a big policy proposal this week that really has commanded a lot of attention.
Yeah, so I admire her kind of touching faith in people caring about policy, which is, I don't think, really true in presidential politics. It's a way to reinforce, brand and persona and message, but it is not something that people care about so much in and of itself. But every week she's had a major proposal, most of which I consider preposterous, including this one. It just would be deeply unfair to forgive college debt in this way, in my mind. One, because people were, took it on with eyes wide open. And two, there are lots of people who have duly paid off their student debt, worked it off, and why should they, in effect, have to pay for the student debt of people coming after them? It's also, in Democratic terms, is not a progressive policy because it would be skewed towards the upper middle class. Upper middle class kids tend to go to college more and to take on more debt. So I don't think this makes a lot of sense, and also is really not spot on what the problem is, which is the just soaring tuition costs and costs of college, which has at least a large part to do with how government restricts supply and subsidizes demand.
Jonathan, do you agree with that criticism, or is this a good road for Democrats to go down?
I mean, it's a good road for Democrats to go down just to, as Kamala Harris would say, let's have the conversation. Let's have the conversation about Senator Warren's proposal, and maybe we will get to have that conversation that Rich is talking about. I mean, I don't argue with him at all. We should have a conversation about tuition costs and how they keep going up and up and up, and parents, fewer and fewer parents can afford it. But it all has to be part of a larger conversation where I am old enough to remember when these issues like this, like Senator Warren's proposal on college debt, or even the Green New Deal, would be the spark for bigger conversations about where we need to push forward as a country. And instead, these kinds of conversations are viewed as less than heroic, as pie in the sky, as sort of, lame excuses for things that aren't going to go anywhere.
I see a lot of criticism of the media or just frustration in general over the fact that Elizabeth Warren and to a lesser degree Kamala Harris are not doing as well or not having as much of a moment as Pete Buttigieg or not getting as much attention as Beto O'Rourke. But, politics is not fair. Is kind of my first reaction to that. And when it comes to this idea that, Warren's producing these serious policy proposals, it's not something that presidential candidates have typically done, and it's not really how policy is made in the White House. And I think this idea that it's unfair, there's something fundamentally sexist about the fact that she's not getting the credit that she is due for coming out with these policy papers is just really strange and not really tethered to the reality of how A, policy is created, or B, how we've typically assessed presidential candidates and elected them. And so to talk about her policy proposal about college tuition or anything else and pick over it right now, it sort of strikes me as like existing in this little fantasy world where it's like she's not a top tier candidate right now if you're judging by the polling or the fundraising, and yet we're kind of assessing her or scrutinizing her in a more serious way than we are many of the other candidates because they're not producing these papers.
Can I just address that quickly? Like, just in the national polling, it's true in Iowa and New Hampshire. Maybe that's more important. Mayor Pete's established a pretty solid third place. But the national polling, he's at 9, and Harris is at 8, and Warren's at 7. He's had a good 4 or 5 weeks and has gone up like 7 points in the national polls and is at, by 1 point ahead of everyone else that's all bunched up together. So I just don't think we should exaggerate how much he's eclipsed anyone. He's gotten more attention in the last few weeks, but there is as Olivia's pointed out, it's a long, long way to go, and there'll be a lot of moments to come.
Well, that's next on my list. Why don't we take a quick break? I will be back with Rich Lowry of National Review, Jonathan Capehart of The Washington Post, and Olivia Nuzzi of New York Magazine to talk about Mayor Pete Buttigieg. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
What do you think? Share your thoughts on today's show on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW and download the KCRW app to listen to Left, Right, and Center on demand.
This week on Lost Notes, the Freeze were an early American punk band. Now, 40 years later, 2 members are reckoning with the lyrics they wrote as teenagers.
I just feel like it's objectifying women.
Why is it embarrassing? You're 17 years old.
You can't just write it off as being 17 years old.
Hi, I'm Jessica Hopper. Lost Notes is a music documentary podcast from KCRW. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm Josh Barrow of New York Magazine. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Jonathan Capehart, columnist at The Washington Post. And Olivia Nuzzi, Washington correspondent for New York Magazine, is also with us. Olivia, you have the cover story in the most recent issue of New York, which is a profile of Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I should note, as I did last week, my husband is a professional political fundraiser, and the mayor is one of his clients. Olivia, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you were mentioning before the break, which is the frustrated reaction you have heard, not just to your piece, but sort of the big burst of coverage that the mayor has gotten. And I take your point that a presidential primary campaign is not normally a contest to see who can have the longest and best white papers, but it's also not normal in a presidential campaign to be nominating the 37-year-old mayor of South Bend to be president of the United States. So isn't there sort of a reasonable, like, who is this guy, why him reaction from people who are fans of some of these U.S. senators with much longer careers?
Yeah, I'm not saying that, people can't have that reaction if they want to. I think it's unusual that a mayor of a town with 100,000 people is even being talked about as a potential presidential candidate. But at the same time, I am sympathetic to what the Mayor Pete camp's argument is, which is that he probably has more control over more people's lives on a daily basis than somebody in the Senate or in the House, who's probably not doing much on a day-to-day basis. But a lot of the criticism just seems to be, why isn't this going better for people who deserve it more? And that's just not the way that this works, unfortunately, right? It would be great if people who were super qualified or who were just really great human beings always got ahead. But you don't really need to look very far. You just have to look at C-SPAN or Fox News and see who is occupying the Oval Office right now to know that that's not the way that this works. And I also think it's a little strange. It's like we're talking about these policy ideas as if this were a normal Democratic primary, as if Donald Trump were not in the White House. And it feels a bit like wishful thinking, I guess, is my reaction to that.
To your point about, politics isn't fair, earlier in April, someone sent out a tweet basically asking the question, why isn't a Harvard-educated former mayor of the 7th largest city in America and who was a cabinet secretary getting the same amount of attention as Mayor Pete? And that's Julian Castro. They both went to Harvard. They're both mayors. And on paper, Secretary Castro
went to Stanford, I think.
Well,
right.
He went to Harvard Law.
Oh, sorry.
He went to Stanford undergrad, Harvard Law.
He went to Stanford and Harvard.
Right. He went to Stanford and Harvard. So did his twin brother, but that's a whole other conversation. But on paper, Secretary Castro should be the one who's getting all of this attention, and instead it's all on Mayor Pete. But I think that
He's not ready to elect a twin, I think. It's true, but I think with Castro, it's interesting because from the beginning, when he announced his exploratory committee, there's very little national coverage. And I remember at the time being a bit confused because the New York Times, when Elizabeth Warren announced her exploratory committee, their headline was Elizabeth Warren is announcing she's running for president. She's the first prominent Democrat to get into the race. And yet him announcing his exploratory committee received barely a mention. And so I think there's this kind of there are favorites with the media, even if we don't like to admit that. And I think the best place to see that is when it comes to the coverage of Julian Castro.
Rich, what have you made of that boomlet? I mean, I know you were talking before the break about that the national poll numbers don't seem to support it yet.
Well, I mean, he's definitely gone up, and it's especially in such a crowded field, you have to be able to catch people's attention, and he did, beginning with that CNN town hall. But there's just no substitute in presidential politics for charisma and grabbing people's attention. And this is just where I think, unfortunately, Elizabeth Warren has a deficit, and it's not necessarily that she's a woman. She just doesn't have that quality. If AOC were in this race, she'd be knocking people's socks off, I think, just because she has that X factor. And presidential politics is different than running for Congress, Senate, governor, or anything else, because there's just such a premium on that.
Olivia, I want to ask, do you agree with that about Elizabeth Warren? Because I know this is a hobby horse for Dave Weigel, who's covering the campaign for the Washington Post. He insists that Elizabeth Warren actually is charismatic. She's very good with crowds. And what he thinks is that people confuse two things, that Elizabeth Warren has this very damaging story about her claim of Native American heritage that really has caused a lot of harm to her public image, and I think makes it difficult for her to successfully connect with some voters who she otherwise would. And that's the thing. It's not that she actually has a charisma deficit.
Well, I think it's so subjective, though, right? Who I think is likable is not necessarily who you think is likable, though I think there's a lot of overlap there. But but when I watched Elizabeth Warren, I was in New Hampshire during her town hall, and I went to a watch party with a bunch of her supporters. And when you watch someone's performance surrounded by their supporters who are cheering for them, it can color your perception of how well they did. But I found her to come off immensely warm. I felt like if she had been selling me oatmeal during that town hall, I would have probably bought some. She had nothing about her, struck me as being off-putting, at least when it came to her demeanor or, the way that she talked about her ideas. But I do think that there's a point about the Pocahontas thing really penetrating, and even people who are not very looped into politics, they know about that, and they know about her nickname that the president gave her. And that's the trouble with dealing with somebody like Donald Trump, right? It's a bully. He can tag you with a name and it'll stick, and it doesn't really matter who you are as a person or what you have to say.
Although that was a problem for her before Donald Trump was on the national it was a big issue in the 2012 Senate race.
But I think that he latching onto that the way that he did, and he hasn't really talked about her too much since then. I think he even said out loud, like, I'm holding my fire. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, until the race gets underway, because he didn't want to hit it too hard. But I think that when he latches onto something, it becomes a CNN chyron, it's on Fox News, you hear about it constantly. It becomes a joke too, becomes kind of an ironic meme for other people who are like sort of interested in politics but not cable news junkies, I think it penetrates in a way that maybe it doesn't.
And also in this case, she reacted, right? It pushed her into taking this test, which ended up being offensive to various constituencies, and she let it get it into her head, which is the real skill that Trump has as
But that's also the
adversary.
brilliance of Mayor Pete, right? Is that his whole thing is, and we haven't seen this in practice yet because the president has not yet dubbed him with the nickname, although I haven't looked at Twitter in the last 10 minutes, but the last time I checked, he hadn't done that.
The president told Sean Hannity he's rooting for Mayor Pete.
Right. But Mayor Pete's whole thing, he doesn't really mention Trump by name. He attacks Mike Pence, by framing it as, Mike Pence being of poor character and him having a problem with his homosexuality. He says is, a problem with his creator, which is very effective.
It's a biblical fight that they're having, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's a very effective way to attack the president without attacking the president. But when he does talk about the president, he'll say the current president. He doesn't say Donald Trump. He doesn't say, that fascist in the Oval Office the way that maybe Gillibrand does on the stump.
There's one other thing I want to discuss regarding Mayor Pete, which is there was this sort of odd column from former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, basically complaining that there's been too much attention to Mayor Pete being gay, and what about all these other interesting things about Mayor Pete? And there were many weird things about this column, but one is I actually think it mischaracterizes the coverage. I think that there has been sort of surprisingly little focus on his sexual orientation. Obviously, it's been widely discussed, but I think it hasn't driven his narrative as much as it could have. And I also think that people have sort of glossed past the political question about that, which is to say, when you look in the General Social Survey, there's been a huge increase in approval of gay people in America. And when the question they ask, is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? There's been a huge drop in the number of people who say yes to that over the decades. But the absolute number is still high. It's almost half of Republicans, and it's about 30% of Democrats and independents. And so, Jonathan, I'm wondering, is his sexual orientation a hidden problem for him that's being under-discussed? Are there some voters who aren't going to go out there and say, I don't want to vote for a gay candidate, but you still have a large chunk even in the Democratic electorate that might be a stumbling block for?
Well, we're about to find out. In the same way that when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, the big question was, are they, and by they we meant white people, going to vote for him? And there were a lot of people who thought his being black is going to be a problem. On top of it, his name is Barack Hussein Obama. So what on earth is going to happen? And then when Iowa happened, Black people came around who were, off to the side, and then the nation came around. I think with Mayor Pete, we're going to see that. We're going to see the gay version of that. America is going to be put to the test right now to see whether the American people are truly ready in their minds and in their hearts to vote for someone who is not like them, who is not straight. I do think the fact that he's married, quotes scripture, is willing to go toe-to-toe. And when I said interjected with Olivia, it's a biblical fight that he is joining with Mike Pence. We've never seen that, certainly in the Democratic primary process, but an openly gay married man going biblical battle with a sitting vice president who uses the Bible as a blast shield against all sorts of things, and using the Bible, as Mayor Pete says, to hurt people. We're about to find out the answer to your question in a few months.
I wonder, though, my privilege is that I could forget that Mayor Pete was gay, and I had to keep reminding myself when I was doing this profile, reading about him and reading his book, watching all of his interviews, and I kept being like, oh, right, he's gay. And that's because I'm able to forget that because of the privilege of my upbringing and where I live. And a lot of voters are like me in that sense. A lot of these voters, this they that you're talking about, are straight white people. And I wonder, by the time that really becomes clear to them that this is a gay man, will it be besides the point because they've already become acquainted with all of the other aspects of his personality and his platform? And in that sense, it seems much easier in a lot of ways than what Barack Obama faced, because this is, not something that's as visible as race.
Rich, I think it's interesting so far, and it's early yet. Republicans seem very reluctant to have an argument about sexual orientation, even social conservatives. I mean, you see some exceptions to that. You had Franklin Graham out there saying that Pete needs to repent for his homosexuality. But, if you compare this to what parts of the conservative movement would have looked like 15 years ago, it feels like a conversation that people are remarkably uneager to have.
Yep, that's true. And just generally the electoral effects. I agree with Jonathan. Obviously, people had all those were wondering about whether Obama's race would hurt him and his name and all that. And it ended up helping, one, because the historic nature of his candidacy really played into his narrative in that race, kind of turning the page narrative. And two, really juicing up African-American turnout helped in a lot of key places. I think the risk with Buttigieg is not that most of the people who find it most off-putting aren't reachable for him anyway. But what I wonder about, and I think this could be analogous to Mitt Romney's Mormonism, is that ended up being a suppressant just a little bit at the margins with evangelical voters, with part of the Republican base, and that was hurtful to Romney. I wonder whether it'll be, if Pete's actually the nominee, whether it'll be a little bit of a suppressant to African Americans, who I imagine are if you look at the polling, are much more socially conservative on this question than the rest of the Democratic Party.
Well, Rich, I have an anecdotal possible answer for you. My mother is a born-again Christian, born and raised in Jim Crow, North Carolina, late 70s. And, she follows politics, but, loosely. She, just on Easter Sunday during brunch, as we were talking, she said, who I'm looking at and paying attention to and who impresses me? And I asked her who, and she said, Pete Buttigieg. Now, what knocked me back about that is my mom, unless the name is simple like Harris or Smith or Jones, she can't pronounce anyone's last name. The fact that
I really hope your mom is not listening to this broadcast.
but the fact that she knew who he was, could pronounce his name perfectly, told me that he is speaking in a way that is reaching people across socioeconomic and cultural lines. And the fact that he is openly gay and married didn't play, at least we didn't have this conversation, play much into what she was thinking about him. And so I think Mayor Pete has this ability to talk to all groups of people in a way that hits them not so much in the head, but in the heart. Here's this guy, this young guy who speaks so well, speaks from the heart, answers questions, and does it in such a way that seems genuine, that seems authentic. I think will resonate. He will have a problem, as has been discussed over the last week, with the situation with the police chief, the firing of the police chief in South Bend, some of the impacts of his policies to turn South Bend around and how that's impacted the African-American community. He's going to be held accountable for that. He's going to be asked questions about that. And the way he answers those questions will determine how the African-American community responds to him, more so than the fact that he's gay.
I want to turn away from the campaign for a moment and talk about what's going on in Washington. And you've had this conversation since the release of the Mueller report among Democrats. There's a case in here that you can make that the president committed criminal obstruction of justice. Should there be an impeachment inquiry that follows from that? And Rich, I know you were interested in the way that Speaker Nancy Pelosi has been handling that conversation.
Yeah, she's moved a little bit, and my interest in this, Josh, is not just what might be good for the country, but whether my end of the year prediction on this show will end up being correct or not. And I said that Democrats would crab walk their way to impeachment, and my faith in that prediction was shaken when Pelosi was so strong a month or so ago, setting out the standard. We're not doing this unless there's bipartisan support for it, because there's no point to it otherwise, which is, I think, the correct position. But she said last several days that actually we're going to investigate, and if the facts bear out the worst, we'll have no choice, which is a different position. And I think she still thinks of let's wait, let's investigate more, let's get facts as a way of kind of dissipating the drive for impeachment and delaying it until you can say, look, we're getting close to a presidential election, let's just let it go. But others in the party are thinking of all this as a prelude to impeachment. And I'm not sure Nancy Pelosi is going to be right in how she thinks this might turn out.
Jonathan, I feel like underlying this is sort of a question about what impeachment is for. Is impeachment simply a process for removing a president, in which case it only makes sense to proceed with it if you think that you can actually get the Senate to vote by 2/3 to do so? Or is impeachment simply a process for holding a president accountable? Because a lot of people have been making arguments essentially like Congress, like the House has a moral obligation to impeach, even if they know the Senate will not remove, just because it's an expression that the president's behavior was so unacceptable.
And so I love the way you frame that, because this is where the Democratic Party is. People who view impeachment as a way of removing the president, that is basically the rank and file of the party. They so hate this man that they think that impeachment, you impeach him, he'll be removed from office. Whereas the folks who are saying, no, actually this process of having hearings and crab walking our way to having impeachment proceedings, that is where the committee chairmen are. That's where they are. And really, when you listen to any conversation Speaker Pelosi has had about the role of Congress, she always says we are Article 1, Constitution, checks and balances on the executive. Impeachment proceedings or these committee hearings, looking at the Mueller report, looking at all aspects of the Trump administration, looking at the agencies and holding them accountable, that's Article 1 responsibility. And so I think it's incumbent upon the Speaker and upon the committee chairman to keep crab walking, as Rich says, because that is their role, to hold the president accountable, to hold his administration accountable. And at which time, when there is so much a tsunami of evidence that requires impeachment proceedings to happen, we already know that the Democratic Party, the rank and file, they're already there. It'll just make it even easier for the Democrats on the Hill to say, you know what, we have no choice but to start impeachment proceedings. But the one thing, as all of us know, but most of the folks who think impeachment will remove the president don't know, is that impeachment is just step one of a two-step process. And the problem is, yes, you can impeach President Trump, but you will not be able to remove him at trial, which takes place in the Senate.
It's funny to me, Olivia, that a lot of the conversation among Democrats, there's this question of, would it be a political mistake to impeach the president? Does it look like overreach, or does it just distract from issues like health care that have a bigger attraction to voters? You could imagine a situation in which the president would want to be impeached because it would make him into a martyr. It would rally conservatives around him. But it's clear that's not the case. The president does not want to be impeached and is out there loudly making the case about why it would be so improper to impeach him. Should Democrats infer something from the president not wanting this fight, that maybe it is advantageous to them to make it?
I guess, why do we think that he doesn't want it? Because he said that out loud. I mean, he says a lot of things out loud that are not true. And so I wouldn't take his statements as any kind of fact. And he has said after the midterms, he said a few different times in different ways that he's looking forward to fights and that he would welcome them and that it would energize his base and would be good for him. And I think that he is very aware, not that he's a student of recent political history, but he's very aware of the effect that it had on Bill Clinton's approval numbers and the public perception of Bill Clinton. And I don't know if I think that frightens him. What I think frightens him is, oh God, what if they get my tax returns? Oh God, what if they reveal something that I don't want to be revealed? But you were asking whether or not, to view this as removing the president or, some kind of moral correction. And I was thinking about the fact that Newt Gingrich, after the result of the Bill Clinton impeachment, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, maybe that was the right outcome. To
impeach him but not remove him.
Yeah, maybe that was in the end what was required in that scenario. And I wonder if there will be any Democrats who kind of come around to having a pragmatic view of potential impeachment like that.
Olivia Nuzzi, Washington correspondent for New York Magazine, thank you for joining us. Now it is time for Tweets of the Week. Sometimes it only takes 140 characters or maybe 280 to distill the spirit of the week. Rich Lowry, what's your tweet of the week?
I liked a tweet thread from Charles Lane of the Washington Post defending Joe Biden on the crime bill, which he's taken a lot of flack for, and Lane points out some context, says in 1993, 87% of the public said the crime rate was higher than 3 years previously. The murder rate was twice as high as it was today. 49% said crime was the top U.S. problem, and 58% of non-whites supported Biden's bill.
Jonathan Capehart, what tweet struck you?
So there was a tweet from the actress Yvette Nicole Brown responding to a Washington Post story. Bernie Sanders gets tough reception at minority women's event, signaling challenges ahead for his 2020 run. And Yvette Nicole Brown tweeted, "We don't like him. Yes, I said we. At me at your own peril." And that speaks to the larger issue here, which is Bernie Sanders had a problem with African-American voters in 2016. And as that reception showed, there women and black women in particular are very angry and will remain angry at Bernie Sanders because of it.
My tweet of the week is from Lynette Lopez, senior finance correspondent at Business Insider. She tweets, "Here's a story about some of the pettiest men in America." The tweet is a link to a Wall Street Journal article you really should read about actor Tom Arnold secretly taping a phone conversation he had with Michael Cohen, in which Cohen took satisfaction in the downfall of Michael Avenatti and, perhaps more importantly, claimed he didn't actually commit crimes he pleaded guilty to. You may be asking, what the hell is Tom Arnold doing here? And that is a good question. Arnold has styled himself a Trump investigator and has sought to befriend Cohen. The Journal says, quote, "Mr. Arnold said he made the call to give Mr. Cohen moral support. He said he recorded the conversation because Mr. Cohen, quote, tapes everything, and I wanted to remember what we talked about," unquote. There you have it. Michael Cohen, role model. I will be back with Jonathan Capehart of The Washington Post and Rich Lowry of National Review to talk with an economist who walked into a brothel. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
Join the conversation on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW. Stream all episodes of Left, Right, and Center and other great shows at kcrw.com/podcasts.
Hey, it's Ken White. 10 years ago, would you have thought that White House legal strategy would be a dinner table topic? Keep up. Every week, join me and Josh Barrow, hosts of KCRW's Left, Right, and Center, for LRC Presents All the President's Lawyers. We're here to help everyone navigate the legal dramas dominating politics today. Get it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm your host, Josh Barrow. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Jonathan Capehart, columnist at The Washington Post. Now we're going to talk about risk, and joining us to do that is Allison Schrager. Allison is an economist and a journalist, and her academic expertise is in retirement. She studies how people need to prepare for retirement. Retirement planning is fundamentally a question of risk. How sure are you about how much wealth you will have accrued by the time you want to retire, and how will you spread out your consumption of that wealth when there is risk that you will live for a very long time? But that's just one example of risk. Risk is everywhere in the economy and in our lives, and in her new book, Allison looks at unusual risks faced by unusual people and what we all can learn from how they manage those risks. The book is called An Economist Walks into a Brothel and Other Unexpected Places to Understand Risk. Hello, Allison.
Hello.
So I'm actually not going to start with the brothel. I want to start with the paparazzi. You spent time with people in a lot of different professions for this book, and you write about two different kinds of financial risk that paparazzi photographers have found a way to manage.
Yeah, so what they're really dealing with is risks that we all face. It's just magnified in a lot of ways. So as you can imagine, the paparazzi face a lot of what we call in finance idiosyncratic risk, which is just the risk like an individual stock will go up and down, like Facebook changes management. And so you can imagine if you're a paparazzo that the odds that you're going to get that money shot in one given day is totally random and based on your individual luck. So what they do to manage that risk is the same thing people do in finance, which is diversify. So they form these alliances of other paparazzo and share tips, sometimes royalties. And what that's doing is diversifying, so getting rid of this idiosyncratic risk. But their one problem is that because getting an exclusive shot is so valuable, what they often do is cheat on their alliance. And the alliances are, like you said, they're informal, but they actually get these little kicky names like Paco or Bowery Boys, but then they always fall apart. So all the paparazzi like kind of hate each other because they all have these like bitter histories of cheating each other. But the bigger risk they're facing is the risk that everyone's facing, which is systematic risk, which is the risk that an entire market will crash like it did in 2008. And in finance, that's always a much more dangerous risk because everything falls together. It's a lot harder to manage it. And the paparazzi are dealing with a lot of that lately because it actually goes in cycles. There was something called, and this is the technical name, I didn't come up with it, a gold rush era, which was what they called the Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears with the umbrella days, when they would get $15,000 for something called a Just Like Us shot, which is like a picture of a celebrity getting coffee. So you're just like us. And I discovered that these sorts of pictures have very high what we call beta, which is they're incredibly sensitive to the state of the market. But the problem is after the recession, the market for Just Like Us pictures just crashed. What was $15,000 is now $5. And they're really struggling to figure out a risk model to deal with this, especially as new risks come along, like Instagram, which involves celebrities now scooping them and taking pictures themselves and posting them. Or even there's a lawsuit right now, I think, with Gigi Hadid. They're suing her because she used one of their pictures on Instagram without permission.
So the reason I wanted to have you on here on our politics show is that the government plays a huge role in helping people manage risk. And one thing you say in the book is that it's not just paparazzi who perceive an increase in systematic risk in the labor market. There are a lot of people with good reason to worry that doing their jobs really well will not be enough to keep them afloat, that their whole industry could get screwed in some way that would be financially devastating for them. That would seem to have a lot of policy implications.
Totally. I think this is like, honestly, a way to think about all the debates we're having really comes down to where does the responsibility lie for risk and what is the government's job to take on risk on behalf of its citizens? I mean, we've already been decided, and this is a good thing, that we have a safety net, which is a way the government does risk manage. And that's efficient. It's good to have the government take on some risk because they can diversify across everyone. So it's generally good, but the problem is, it can go too far or worse, get incredibly expensive. So when I hear all these debates that people are having, for me, I often hear of deciding where does the government take on risk? Like there's a risk you will go to college and that loan will not pay off because you'll drop out or it won't be a useful degree. Does the government bail you out and take on that risk for you? Or should you bear that risk yourself from making maybe not a great choice?
Rich, I feel like a lot of this has been, in a weird way, central to the Donald Trump pitch as he has taken over the Republican Party. His pitch to voters in many ways was all about risks and talking about that, immigration poses a risk to your financial condition because of how it affects the job market. He also poses it as a security risk and talks extensively about crime and frames these issues as one of being protecting people from danger. And then he also backed off some typical Republican ideas that have alienated some voters because of the feeling that they will expose people to risk. He went out there and said that he's going to protect Social Security and Medicare and even Medicaid, when a lot of other Republican candidates have at least nodded toward the idea that they might want to make cuts in those programs or change them in ways that would move more risk off the government toward individuals. And I guess the question is that the right shift for the Republican Party? Should the government play a larger role in managing risk than a lot of the more libertarian strains of the Republican Party have historically wanted it to do?
Yeah, so he moved the median Republican message from about freedom to taking care of you, which is not a typical Republican message, at least the last 5 or 6 decades. And again, I as I say so often with Trump, he's on to something, but it's not fully thought through, and it's often too blunderbuss. But I do think there are creative Republican policies that can avoid some of the problems of the government programs as they exist now and entitlements that they exist now, that could address these problems in a more deft way. But Trump definitely shifted the conversation and the iteration of the party almost overnight on this.
We actually see there's a lot of studies of times of great systematic risk of being correlated throughout the Middle Ages of an increase in witch trials and persecution of Jews. You tend to get these strong men when people sense more risk.
Yeah, and I think, Jonathan, this is something that drives Democrats crazy about Donald Trump is, first of all, the feeling among Democrats is we're the party that protects people from risk. That's our brand. That's our policy platform for decades. And so what has happened so that you had so many voters out there who didn't buy that, who didn't think that Democrats were going to protect them from relevant risks in their lives, and who bought into the idea from Donald Trump that he would?
This is why I think one of the reasons why I think Mayor Pete is resonating with a lot of people. For the very word that Rich just used, that the Republican Party has gone from the party of freedom to the party of taking care of you. Mayor Pete, one of his pitches is, the Republican Party has taken the words freedom and security and democracy away from the Democratic Party, and that the Democratic Party needs to take those words back. And when it comes to freedom, he says, how free are you when you are not free because of the credit card companies or because the bigotry of your neighbor or next door or people down the street? That there is this idea that, for certain kinds of risk that we're talking about, government does have a role. And so, I think that the pitch, such as it is from Mayor Pete, is one that I think Democrats in general should embrace, because it goes to battle directly with President Trump, directly with the Republican Party about what it means to be free, what it means to be secure, what it means to live in a democracy.
Allison, I tend to think of you as someone with pretty conservative policy views, at least on the economy. But one of the themes in your book, you talk about the difficulty that individuals have managing the risks of their own retirement. One is just that the math is very complicated. It is hard for ordinary people to figure out how much wealth they really need in order to enjoy the kind of retirement that they envision for themselves. And then you also have this issue of longevity risk. People don't know how long they're going to live, so they don't know how much of their wealth they can spend in a given year in retirement. In theory, you can fix that with an annuity, but annuities are very expensive to buy, in part because interest rates are so low. Is this a problem that demands more government intervention? I mean, Social Security is a way of dealing with both of these risks. It deals with the longevity risk by pooling that risk across the entire population. It's like buying an annuity for the entire country. And it calculates savings for people on their behalf so they don't have to do that math. And especially with you making the point about how, increased perceptions of risk can lead to, sort of dangerous currents in terms of authoritarianism. Is it a time for the government to be taking on more of this financial risk from the public?
Perhaps, certainly for some people. I think I said it depends on, higher earners, probably people with more money are probably better poised to bear this risk. Lower earners, not so. Of course, they already get a fairly high replacement rate from Social Security. I think the optimal solution that, policymakers in this space have come to is there has to be a lot of risk sharing. Individuals bear some of it, and the government needs to lay the foundation of that. And where that is, as I said, really depends on individuals. And also there's a lot more policymakers can do to help individuals take on that risk. It could be encouraging more annuitization. It could be regulating that market so they're more affordable. And obviously just a lot more education and working with employers where they have better default options so people are making choices around retirement that make more sense for them.
Finally, I want to talk about a really big risk, which is to do with climate change. And Allison, one thing you talk about in the book is the distinction between risk and uncertainty, that there are things that we know there's a set of possible outcomes. It's like rolling a die. You don't know how it's going to come up, but it comes up 1/6 of the time it comes up on 6. But then you also have things where you don't even know what kind of level of risk you're facing. And so we have these questions about, expensive things we might do to prevent climate change, to change the economy, to reduce carbon emissions, to deal with an uncertain, but we think quite possibly very large cost that not doing that would impose. How do you think about that policy challenge when you're trying to go to people and ask them to do something very expensive up front, when you can't tell them with a high degree of certainty what the payoff is going to be and when, but you think that quite possibly the payoff is very large?
Well, I mean, I think with climate change, it's the downside risk you're trying to avoid. It's not the payoff. It's, avoiding a lot of people think is an existential threat. The problem is neither side does themselves any favors because we don't really fully understand. There's a range of things that 2-degree temperature increase could mean. And a lot of them, as I said, we can imagine. Some of them are just off distribution. And the downside is so dangerous. You could rationalize that it justifies, spending money to get rid of it. But the problem is a lot of activists, don't want to acknowledge that there's any uncertainty around it. So they kind of make often sort of dubious claims that honestly hurts their case. I think the risk of downside is significant enough that it merits taking action and taking steps to reduce the risk.
Allison Schrager wrote the book An Economist Walks Into a Brothel, and she's also an economist and a journalist at Quartz. Allison, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We have reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. Rich Lowry, it's your soapbox.
The New York Yankees and the Philadelphia Flyers have dumped Kate Smith's rendition of God Bless America, and the Flyers have even removed a statue of Kate Smith from outside their arena because of a couple of songs with racially offensive lyrics that Kate Smith performed in the early 1930s. But these lapses, unfortunately not unusual for the time, by no means define her work or her life or blot out the incredibly selfless service she performed to this country during World War II. Our ahistorical and senselessly destructive cultural revolution continues apace.
Jonathan Capehart, what's your rant?
My rant is on Senator Bernie Sanders' response to a question at the CNN town hall from a young woman asking if convicted violent felons, such as the Boston Marathon bomber, should have the right to vote while serving their sentences. And Bernie Sanders said unequivocally, yes, that voting is such a fundamental right that it should not be abridged. But I go back to something my editorial page editor at the New York Daily News said over and over again when I first started: no right is absolute. And when it comes to violent felons, convicted violent felons, people who are in jail for doing really horrible things, no, they should not have the right to vote. That when you have been convicted of a felony, that you do lose some rights, and that voting while serving your time is not something I can get behind. However, once you have served that time, once you have paid your debts to society, I absolutely think that you should get that right back, because the right to vote is a sacred right of people who are living free in a democracy, or at least hopefully living free in a democracy, assuming that their right to vote is not abridged through voter suppression efforts.
For my rant, we got the initial estimate of first quarter GDP on Friday, and the print was 3.2% growth, which healthily beat expectations. Initial estimates do get revised, but this is consistent with other positive economic data that we've been seeing recently, including very strong retail sales in March. One of the biggest things President Trump has going for him is a good economy. Back in December, there were significant market jitters, and there were reasons to wonder if that might be changing. Of course, anything can change in the future, but right now the odds point toward continued, stable, positive economic growth and the tailwind that can provide the president as he seeks re-election. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Rich Lowry, Jonathan Capehart, Olivia Nuzzi, and Allison Schrager. Left, Right, and Center is produced by Sarah Fay. Our technical director is JC Swadek. Katie Burskins and Colin Cab Washington are our production assistants. Todd M. Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.
This season on Lost Notes from KCRW.
How does it feel to be like a girl playing an instrument? Well, how does it feel to be a man asking stupid questions? I mean, what...
Had I said no to this invitation from John Fahey, I would have for the rest of my life wondered what I had missed.
We're thinking about Billy Tipton at a very interesting time because I don't know that young people and older people agree on the meaning of trans.
I love you for the greatest, Sean. I love that it is an unholy album made with holy methods.
Once I wanted to be.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Hopper. I'm a music journalist, an author, and your host for Season 2 of Lost Notes. On Lost Notes, we look at music's untold stories. This season is packed. It's about legacies. How do they hold up? And how do they change over time?
Disco se aage literally means beyond disco.
Learn how, decades on, a song can find new meaning, something different than when it was written.
I just feel like it's objectifying women.
Too long. 17 years old.
Yeah, now I'm 56, and it's freaking embarrassing.
Why is it embarrassing? You're 17 years old.
You can't just write it off as being 17 years old.
Hear from pioneering women who've been written out of music's history.
I get there, and the producer says, well, no, we're not doing your music. We have a script here, and we want you to do the sound.
Plus, find out what happens when we apply our 2019 politics to 1974's songs.
We didn't think about it as We were an all-girl band. We were out to prove a point. We just lived the music.
The first episode of this season of Lost Notes arrives April 25th. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.